All right, I think we're ready to get started. I feel like everybody's come on in. So welcome to the CCS Philanthropy Pulse webinar, where we're going to discuss what the data says and maybe what it might mean for some independent schools. So I'm gonna start by introducing myself. I'm Kate Villa. I am one of two executives of our New England team, and I've been at CCS for more than a decade now, which seems sort of unbelievable. I've been working in independent schools since I started calling for the independent school that I went to's telethon in 1990, which dates me. And I led two independent school campaigns in New York City before joining CCS. I've also been fortunate to have done many multiples more than that in my time with CCS because I have a real passion for the unique value proposition that each school provides. I know this from firsthand experience as a graduate and as a donor. And I know as a campaign counsel and fundraising support that each school's commitment to helping students find their voice to change the world is an important cause which is worthy of our collective best possible work. So Bob and I are excited to be here with you today to talk about some trends that can help us do just that. Bob, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Bob Weston. I am a Senior Vice President with CCS, and I am the practice lead for independent schoolwork. And I've been with CCS for 4 years after having spent 30 years in independent school as an educator, administrator, fundraiser. So like Kate, share a passion for this work and happy to be with you this afternoon to share some data. So Kate, you want to get us started?
I do. So just to sort of walk you through what we're going to do today, we're going to do a high-level reminder of where education sits in the greater philanthropic landscape. We're going to share some independent school data and trends from the survey that we did last fall. And then knowing that we've all been in a lot of webinars, we're going to break into breakout rooms and talk to each other about what that might mean and crowdsource some good ideas. So first, we're going to sort of orient to the philanthropic landscape and the report data. So when we look at the Giving USA data from 2021, we presented this in June of last year, and it was hot off the presses. And we talked about $471 billion being a 5.1% increase from 2019. And then on average, that meant that individuals, foundations, and corporations gave almost $1.3 billion every day. And if you're remembering back to thinking about last June, that was when Mackenzie Scott had just announced her first almost $2.8 billion in new gifts, which we all know is extraordinary and keeps coming. But that just means that that kind of philanthropic capital was infused into the nonprofit sector every 2 days in the United States. And so while we don't have 2021 Giving USA estimations until this June, we wanted to share that the Fundraising Effectiveness Project found that for the 9,000 plus organizations in its sample, giving in the first 3 quarters of 2021 grew in aggregate by about 1.4% compared to 2020. So knowing that there's still time for it to keep growing, will it be bigger or less than 5.1%? We'll have to wait till June to find that out. We also shared that giving grew in 8 out of 10 sectors and that religion received the largest amount of donations, which has been true for as long as Giving USA has been tracking this data. But we also want to note that this has changed over time. Back in the 50s and 60s, that would have been 65% of all giving compared to sort of the 28% that it is today. And so when we think about what has become sort of those secular pieces that are taking more and more shares of the pie, education still inches out on top over human services. And it's the second largest share of that financial support. So $71.34 billion, that's not just independent schools. Obviously that's higher ed, it's charter schools, it's all types of schools. But that was a 9% increase from 2019. And if those of us think back of where we were in 2020, right? We remember our COVID-19 funds. We remember fueling support for financial aid for families who, we thought might not be able to return in the fall of 2020. We can remember the incredible support for faculty under incredible pandemic strain, and just people coming together in historic new ways, parents especially, but everyone, as our communities really pulled together to keep kids in school, kids in person, and our schools healthy with enough, facilities that were safe and had the right air ventilation and the right sort of rejiggering of spaces. And obviously that was significant extra expense. So a little history of sort of where we were in 2020, and then it feels like the whole world has changed, right? So as we start to look to newer data, we're excited to share what we learned, last fall. So when we look at the CCS Philanthropy Pulse, there were 138 independent schools who responded. And this was based on data collected via the online survey in October and November of 2021. And hopefully all of you were part of that. It's a subset of 877 responses from across sectors. So you'll see on the next slide, right, there's a thing about membership. Obviously, independent schools don't have membership, but we had the makeup of our survey participants to provide a window into a wide array of organizational sizes and geographic locations. And so a third of you were from the Northeastern United States, and most respondents were from the United States. And about 3/4 had annual operating budgets between $1 million and $25 million, with 10 to 25 being the highest sort of category and most well represented. And when asked about the operating model for school fundraising functions, it was pretty evenly split. So as we think about advancement, I think this might be the first time I've seen advancement inching out over development as sort of the primary model. And the difference being, development just focusing on fundraising and alumni relations, and advancement where fundraising is integrated into the revenue generating model and includes either marketing and communications or admissions or all of the above. And so when we think about what the data said, it sort of talks about how we got the data, and then let's talk about what it said. So whether you were in development or you were in advancement, the news was pretty good. So those schools who fundraise for major gifts, 60% say they expect an increase from major gifts in 2022, with only 10% saying they expect a decline and 29% saying they expect the results to stay the same. I think that would be an interesting piece to discuss. Like, why do people think this will go up? Is it because of the stock market? Is it because of new programs you've implemented, right? And so I think it's interesting to look at sort of the other pieces along this. So people expect increases in mid-level gifts, in events. I think maybe that's due to a hope that those will come back in person, and also to the annual appeal. And for obvious reasons, some people were really high on events increasing and others thought they might decrease. I think that might be about sort of whether people thought they would be in person or not. And so now that I've gotten the chance to talk through mostly positive high-level trends, I'm going to pass it to Bob, and he'll talk about the more in-depth things and challenges and opportunities.
Right, but still positive. Thanks, Kate. So when we ask the schools, what are your top challenges that you're facing? Probably no surprise to all of you, because fundraising is largely predicated on acquiring donors and then retaining them. And therein lies the challenge. And so not surprising that nearly half the schools shared that they think about and they're challenged by acquiring new donors and then retaining them. And so I think to this point, stewardship becomes really important. And we know that it's important, but oftentimes we don't give it the focus and the attention that it needs. And we'll get to another data point in a few slides, but I think part of the challenge in acquiring donors and retaining them is increasingly schools are relying on parents as donors. And while they may be easier to acquire, they are harder to retain. For obvious reasons, right? When their child is no longer at the school, they tend to move on. And so that retention piece becomes more challenging. Also, we see a real interest and a real desire and a real nervousness, frankly, around not having the resources and the knowledge for plan giving. Plan giving has become an incredibly important part of fundraising, and schools are eager to know more about it. And here you see it as the number one place where schools feel like their staff need to be more knowledgeable. So gift planning, plan giving, so many shops are small. They don't have the expertise in-house to manage this, and they'd like to do more with it. We know certainly in larger campaigns, plan giving is an important piece of that. So, and along with that, research. Again, staffs that are limited oftentimes want more research. They need to know more about their donors. So interesting that when you look at where schools felt like their staff needed more help, gift planning, research. Interestingly, though, before we move on to the next slide, what I found compelling is a little further down, the major gift strategy. You know, we might assume that major gift strategy is a place where schools would feel really comfortable with their fundraisers. But here we also see that there's a real desire for more knowledge, more expertise, more training. So no surprise, perhaps, that where folks feel most comfortable around events and board work. And again, smaller shops spend a lot of time in terms of fundraising activity around events. And we all spend a lot of time around managing the board relations. So when we think about the pandemic and we think about the transitions and the shifts that we all went through, of course, we're thinking about what will we retain. So again, perhaps no surprise here, but reinforces perhaps what you know, virtual events. So I think initially when everybody transitioned, everybody pivoted to virtual events, we were nervous that those weren't going to be engaging. But in fact, we have found that while they can't replace in-person events, these virtual events have been engaging. They've been cost effective, they've been successful. So that piece will remain. Certainly the second one is not unique to schools, but the remote work, the desire for either working remotely part-time or full-time, and certainly with major gift officers who often are traveling quite a bit, the desire to work remotely certainly may not go away. I think the next two pieces of this, though, are particularly interesting, and I think they speak to what Kate alluded to earlier during the pandemic, and that's a real increase in focus on communication. You know, independent school value proposition held up incredibly well, and that's going to be reflected in other pieces of data. But I think what schools learned and did really effectively was the communication piece. So I think whether it's leveraging technology and social media, or really that enhanced personalized communication, I think that those lessons and those plans and that outreach will remain, because I think schools became much more effective in communicating what they were doing, how they were doing, and particularly from a fundraising standpoint, where those funds were being directed and how they were immediately impacting the student experience. So I think we learned a lot of lessons through COVID, and I think some of those in terms of communication will certainly remain. When we think about what the greatest opportunities we see emerging from COVID, interesting that enrollment's number one. And I think enrollment is number one in a couple directions. So again, I think because of that value proposition, I think depending on your market, independent schools saw a real increase in interest. We know affordability is still an issue, and we'll get to the piece about fundraising for financial aid, but a lot of schools really see an opportunity coming out of COVID to bolster enrollment. Then there are other markets where the pandemic hit them a little harder and enrollment softened. And so, but they see opportunity. So whether you are coming at it from a position of relative strength or whether you were weakened in terms of the pandemic, enrollment really is on the minds of schools and where they see opportunity. Again, the communication piece, I think parent morale and engagement, a lot of schools in the survey and a lot of schools that we work with, I think particularly at the K-8 level, really felt that they didn't get to see their parents as we would. And again, they did a great job thinking and being creative in terms of communicating with them. But so many schools, and one of the real distinctive features of the independent school is really being a community that's inclusive. And so a lot of parents are accustomed to be on campus, and that wasn't possible during COVID. So schools now see real opportunity to re-engage parents, to bolster morale, to get them back in the classroom, back in the building. And then the third one here that I'll point out is alumni giving. And this is an ongoing, ever-present desire and opportunity. But again, I think schools found good ways to communicate what they were doing effectively through COVID to their alums, and they see more opportunity there as well. I think, as you all know very well, DEI loomed large last year, and independent schools, again, have done a great job with DEI initiatives. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that broadly speaking, DEI issues have really become part of school strategic plans. They know it's a priority. They wish to be representative. They wish to be diverse in terms of student body, in terms of faculty. So DEI has, no surprise, become an important aspect of strategic planning. On the other side, though, and I found this really compelling, is that DEI has really found its way into donor conversations. So nearly 90% of folks are finding that they're talking about DEI-related issues with their prospective donors, and be that around access, making sure our schools are diverse, are representative of the communities we live in, certainly in faculty, but interesting that DEI as a topic is very much present in donor conversations. So I think that's great. And I think, Kate and I are working with a lot of schools right now that are in campaigns, and those campaigns are really focused around endowment and really increasing endowment for financial assistance for students and faculty. From a more tactical level, what are schools actually doing? Really, it starts at the board level. So I think there's been a real effort to diversify boards, to rethink recruiting practices and how new members are brought on, and certainly training. A lot of schools have done training through their board, through their faculty, with their students, and then thinking about the message, thinking about how we're engaging our constituents, where we're engaging them, what we're sharing with them. So I think from a tactical level, really being mindful of independent schools, really, again, the value add of belonging, and making sure that what we're championing and what we're sharing with our donors is always a sense of belonging, and wanting to deepen that belonging and that sense of community is where we've seen schools work at a tactical level. This one's interesting. When we get asked about annual funding, we're going to talk in the breakout rooms a bit about annual giving. 80% of the respondents met their annual fund goal last year. And I think what's interesting about that is certainly people rallied around COVID. I think donors saw the need. I think both parents and alums appreciated what the schools were doing to, as Kate said, meet safely in person, to protect the integrity of the academic experience. So I think this is really good news that people answered the call and they supported, and 80% of schools met their goal. I will say the data's not in yet. Anecdotally, I think schools are having a bit harder time with their annual funds this year. I think part of it is, the pandemic has gone on much longer than we imagined. I think a lot of you did a heroic job and heroic effort in terms of meeting the annual fund goal last year. And then I think all of a sudden, come July 1, the slate is wiped clean and we start fundraising for the annual fund all over again. And I think there was a bit of fatigue. I think there was a bit of hesitancy to want to go out and ask again, because we asked in such an urgent way, and folks answer that call. So it will be interesting to see where we end up for 2022. But the news was certainly good in 2021 in terms of annual giving and the way people rallied to meet the school's needs. I alluded to this right when I began, parents. And again, I'd be curious, and we don't have it here today, but historically, what the trend line has been, because again, increasingly schools, particularly day schools, have really relied on parents as donors. And that's reflective here. And certainly parents can be alums or they can be trustees, but you'll see, an average of 39% of giving comes from parents. And I'm thinking that percentage has crept up over time. And so, again, I think as you all think about strategies and you think about engagement opportunities, really to think about alumni and how you're thinking about engaging them, acquiring them as donors, and stewarding them will be incredibly important. But parents are important to our schools and are generous and appreciate the value proposition. But and again, an increasing percentage of donors. Campaigns. We talk a lot about campaigns. We work with a lot of schools and campaigns. Interestingly, that two-thirds of schools, or really 3/4, are in some kind of campaign activity. We encourage schools not to pause during the pandemic, which is hard not to do. And the ones that kept going, I think, realized tremendous success. But certainly you can see here that only 16% of schools don't have any plans for a campaign. We're in an environment where schools need resources, whether they be capital projects, whether it be endowment, but campaigns have become an important part of the landscape for independent schools. And we see a lot of schools engaging very successfully in, again, capital projects, but really endowment. And I think the trend, and again, we don't have a data slide here, but anecdotally, I would suggest that more and more schools are raising more and more endowment money, and that's where the focus is in these current campaigns. So they're still undergoing capital projects, but I think they're being very mindful of the power of endowment, both in terms of providing access, but also just in terms of financial durability and sustainability. So there's been a real focus and emphasis on endowment and messages around endowment. So I've talked a lot. I'm going to take a breath, and we're going to head to breakout rooms. And we have 4 topics for our breakout rooms. So Kate's going to, if we go to the next slide, talk a little bit about donor demographics, parents versus alums. I've just been talking about donor retention. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about annual giving and gift planning opportunities. So I don't know, Kate, have you been monitoring the chat? Do we want to address anything?
There was a question about whether or not the parents were alumni parents and current parents were differentiated. And I think that we would call anyone who's been a parent.
Yeah.
So, and I think as Bob said, right, there's a huge shift between, the focus that used to be really on graduates of the school to a focus on both graduates and parents, and a trend that, I think it used to be that people thought that the parents should graduate with the kids. And the durability, as you said about endowments, I think the durability of parents really feeling like this has been a life changer for their family. There's been some good trends about alumni parent fundraising in recent years too. So we thought it would be fun to break into different groups and talk a little bit about parent versus alumni fundraising or donor retention, or really anything you want to talk about, knowing that you'll spend about 10 minutes in a room with me and about 10 minutes in a room with Bob. We'll talk through different giving methods. So there should be some magical people who put us into rooms, and look forward to seeing all of you in one of them. I don't know if everybody wants to come back to the room, but I know we just got cut off in a really interesting conversation about alumni events and people showing up. I don't know what was going on in your room, Bob, but
we were talking about giving days when we got cut off, and if giving days were a good strategy to acquire new donors, or if there was donors were getting accustomed to giving days, so they were just withholding their donation until the giving day rolled around. So again, we got cut off, but really interesting conversation.
Super interesting. I don't know if we all want to come together and finish those conversations, or if we want to wrap up, but it's really interesting to hear that our group was talking about alumni events being down, and someone was like, please tell me it's just me. And then 4 people chimed in and said, nope, not just you. And then someone was talking about volunteerism being down too. So interesting trends beyond sort of what we shared.
I guess I would ask, just in the time that we have remaining, if anyone has any questions or something they'd like to share, either based on what we were talking about or a different topic, but we have a few minutes left, so we'd love to know what's on your mind.
Well, we cut off the good discussion, and then people are quieter now. But I think we could sort of say that if you're interested in more findings from the report, someone chatted me during this and said, "Will we get the deck? We will send you the deck. We'll send you the full report and the recording from today's meeting." So we're really excited to have had you here with us today. I'm grateful.
Hey, Kate, sorry. I had one last one on the one of the decks you had talked about alums, parents, trustees, and sort of the giving sources. Do you have any feel on that trustee number? Is that not typically 90% alums, or sort of do you bunch those together typically as a metric, or do you have any broad stroke feel on that?
We follow the crediting where we say, if you're a parent and alum and a trustee, you're a trustee. If you're a parent and an alum, you're a parent. So we sort of follow that hierarchy of giving. And I think I would say that it depends from school to school. So we work with boarding schools that are suspicious of parents on their board, and we work with day schools that have mostly parents on their board, and everything in between. Right. So I don't think
if you tease that out a little bit of, I guess what I'm trying to get to is, if you sort of say common denominator is alum, whether you're currently a trustee or you're a current parent or you're just an alum, if you look at that matrix through that lens, that alum affiliation, you think it's 70% kind of thing in terms of like that you can walk the halls at some point, regardless of whether you're now a trustee or a parent or do you have any feel for that at all in terms of what that might look like?
I would say that one of the interesting trends over time has been that I think it used to be if you took the people who were on the board, who were parents and who were alumni, and then you said how many of them were, in the alumni, like they had a, comma year after their name, that number was bigger among major supporters than it is now. So I would say that the trends are more parents on boards, more parents as donors, more parents in all areas of your school probably, but we're seeing it in fundraising as well. Bob, did you have something to add?
Nope. You got it.
Well, thank you all for being with us today. It's always so much fun to present trends and to talk about them and to be in breakout rooms and listen to you all talk to each other, because of course, fellowship is really important. So thanks for being with us, and we'll send you all of this via email and look forward to the next time.
Thank you all.